Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's book talk, book launch, book panel, Teaching the Actuality of Revolution with Derek Ford and a host of panelists who we're all really excited to hear from. My name is Kate. I'm here from the People's Forum and 1804 Books, which is one of the co-hosts and co-sponsors of this event. I'll be pretty brief because I know that we have a lot of introductions and a lot of content to get through, but we are a political education center, a community center, a bookstore, a cafe. We wear a lot of different hats, and we have a lot of programming. So, for example, coming up, we have a lecture series with David Harvey on reading Granrisa. Hope I said that right. We also have concerts, fashion shows, more book talks, conferences, panels, so many things. So wherever you are, if you're in New York City, please do stop by. And if you aren't, follow us on social media and our newsletter. We send out media digests every week to hear from struggles all over the world. And a lot of our offerings are hybrid, as is this one, so you can tune in from wherever you are. We also have 1804 Books, which is a community bookstore and press. We have a book coming out in the next month or so, selected speeches of Hugo Chavez, so keep your eyes peeled for that one as well. And I think that's all I'll have to say on that. But other than that, we're really excited to be having this book talk because as a political education center, we're of course really invested in how we create new ways of educating people, teaching them about revolutionary struggle, teaching them how to struggle. And we know that education as it stands today doesn't serve that purpose. So we're really excited to be talking about Derek's book today and this exciting intervention he makes into the educational world of, of creating struggle. I'll pass it over to Maya to do further introductions, but again, thank you to everyone for joining us, and thank you to Iskra and all the hosts for making this possible.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was a wonderful introduction. All right. Hello, friends and comrades, and thank you all for joining us for a very exciting book launch and panel talk in celebration of our newest book release here at Iskra Books, Teaching the Actuality of Revolution, Aesthetics, Unlearning, and the Sensations of Struggle by Derek R. Ford. I am Maya Vielba, one of the editorial board members at Iskra Books and Peace, Land, and Bread. And we are joined today by some truly brilliant speakers and thinkers, and we're thrilled to be joining you today for what should be a very informative and interesting series of talks. So I'd like to begin by thanking the many hands and hard work that went into making this event possible. Firstly, a big thank you to Kate and the comrades over at the People's Forum and 1804 Books for all of your support, hosting and organizing for the event. We appreciate you all and are always excited to collaborate with you folks. Secondly, I'd like to thank all of our event co-sponsors, to our comrades at the Hampton Institute, the Critical Theory Workshop, the Journal for Critical Education, Policy Studies, Mayday Books, who is doing a live stream at their location right now, and especially to Midnight Books in Los Angeles. Oh, sorry, it's Midnight Books in Los Angeles, who are graciously hosting a live showing of the event. We appreciate you all and look forward to many good collaborations to come in the future. So just to kick it off, Derek Ford is a thinker all of us over at Iskra Books deeply admire. We've had the honor of publishing 2 of Derek's books now, and Teaching the Actuality of Revolution excites us for a number of reasons. Most specifically because it sees Derek move into an exploration of aesthetics and art as these relate to revolutionary education, pedagogy, and politics. To quote the distinguished educational theorist and professor Peter McLaren's recent review of Teaching the Actuality of Revolution for the Monthly Review, Derek's latest book, quote, expertly and clearly explains oppression and exploitation as perceptual ecologies and carefully constructs a communist approach to unlearning capital sensorium by performing alternatives in our present. And I think that's a beautiful summary of all of the complex concepts that Derek so eloquently and articulately puts forward in his book. So what is this book we have all come together today to celebrate and discuss? Teaching the Actuality of Revolution, Derek's, as I said, 8th and most recent book, is a work of educational theory which explores the nexus between aesthetics, pedagogy, and politics. illustrating the central role that education plays in reproducing injustices and inhibiting various forms of confidence in the revolutionary struggle, demonstrating how capitalism and its attendant forms of oppression are not merely cognitive, but perceptual. That's a key word that he uses in his book. Teaching the Actuality of Revolution proposes that revolutionary education demands the production of aesthetic experiences through which we sense the possibility and actuality of alternative worlds. To create such encounters, Derek develops a praxis of teaching and a pedagogy of unlearning that, in our current conjecture, creates conditions for encountering what one of our speakers, who unfortunately is unable to be here today but has been a vital voice in this discussion, Jennifer Ponce de Leon, calls an other aesthetics. And so mapping contemporary capital as a perceptual ecology of structures, social relations, beliefs, and feelings, Teaching the Actuality of Revolution provides an extensive new set of concepts, practices, and readings for revolutionaries like us to better plan, enact, reflect on, and refine our organizing efforts. As mentioned, we've brought together some truly brilliant and accomplished speakers, thinkers, and educators today. Derek will be joined in conversation with political scholars and organizers Summer Papachin, Gabriel Rockhill, Michelle Curda, and Kim Smith. And so before I pass the mic over first to Gabriel and then to Derek, the author of Teaching the Actuality of Revolution, I'd like to just briefly introduce myself, our event organizers and sponsors, and then our speakers, so that we can move on to the event, knowing fully the deep amount of experience, expertise, and wisdom we have here on the panel. And so as I said, I am Maya Villalba. I'm an editorial board member over at Peaceland and Bread and Iskra Books. I'm a Chinese and Cuban communist organizer and abolition from Lower Manhattan, New York City. At New York University, I concentrate in social and cultural analysis at the College of Arts and Sciences and serve as the president of the Sexual and Reproductive Health Positive Club, also known as SRH+. As an organizer, I develop political education and cultural programming to cultivate solidarity between the broader New York City community and my organization called the Young Lords Collective. We're a local youth organization working at the intersection between activism and artistry. In my most recent work, which should be published soon by Iskra Books, excitingly, called Wretched Women, A Manifesto on Abolition, Anti-Globalization, and the International Struggle for the Commons, I work through the dark underbelly of global corporate development and explain how social practices, acts of provisioning, and forms of peer governance offer practical tools of resistance against forces of late-stage capitalism. And so I'm very excited to introduce our sponsors. Kate briefly touched upon her work at the People's Forum as a movement incubator for working class and marginalized communities to build unity across historic lines of division at home and abroad. The People's Forum is an accessible educational and cultural space that nurtures the next generation of visionaries and organizers who believe that through collective action, a new world is possible and inevitable. You can find their work at peoplesforum.org. Secondly, we have the Critical Theory Workshop, which is a nonprofit educational institution that seeks to bring affordable education with real use value to a broad public. Originally founded in 2008 as a dual language intensive summer research program in Paris, the workshop has grown over the years tremendously. In addition to their in-person summer school, they offer an online summer program, seminars, and symposia in Philadelphia, as well as online courses and lectures. They have had the good fortune of working with a long list of prestigious speakers over the years, including figures like Domenico Losurdo, Genevieve Fraze, Pierre Machry, Jacques Grassin. I'm like, excuse me for my pronunciation, and many others. They have also made many of their discussions available in their video archive as a free educational resource that you can check out. You can find more information about their 2023 workshop, including registration information, at criticaltheoryworkshop.com. So please be sure to check them out. Next up, we have the Hampton Institute, which is a working class think tank founded in 2013. In contrast to traditional think tanks, they give a platform to working class theorizations, analyses, and commentary. They are named as a tribute to the former Black Panther Party member and revolutionary martyr Fred Hampton, and also take inspiration from Italian Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci and educator and philosopher Paulo Freire, a fan favorite I know personally over at Iskra Books. Hampton does not seek to provide specific policy analysis for political parties. Instead, they seek to build class consciousness and end oppressive systems like capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy, and all in all, seek the liberation of the oppressed class. And so you can also find out more about their work at hamptonthink.org. We have three more people to introduce, so bear with me. Thank you for your patience. We have the Journal for Critical Education Policy Studies, which is a peer-reviewed, open access, and international scholarly journal that has, since 2003, worked to develop Marxist and other leftist analysis and critiques of education. JSEPS, which is short for the Critical Education Policy Studies, seeks and publishes articles that critique global, national, neoliberal, neoconservative, neo-fascist, new labor, third way, postmodernist, and other analyses of policy developments, as well as those that attempt to report on, analyze, and develop socialist and Marxist transformative policies, specifically relating to schooling and education from a number of radical leftist perspectives. And so they address issues of social class, race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and capitalism, critical pedagogies, new public managerialism, and academic and non-academic labor. And so you can find the journal at jceps.org and check out all of the amazing work that they do. So I'm personally am such a fan favorite of the Journal for Critical Education. So by all means, please check out their work. Then we have Midnight Books, which is a radical bookstore and community event space in Uptown Whittier, Southeast LA, California. Since their opening in January 2022, Midnight has participated in several labor campaigns, mutual aid distribution, educational reading groups, and film nights, along with, promoting and creating an atmosphere for music, art, and revolutionary study. Mayday Books, which is located in the exciting West Bank community in Minneapolis, is a volunteer collective dedicated to selling left-wing literature. Mayday provides a space for political education and camaraderie. As a nonprofit bookstore with a progressive educational mission, they provide quality political books to the public, both fiction and nonfiction. And key part, sold at discount rates of 15 to 20% below cover price. So please make sure to check out a book at Mayday Books and Midnight Books and engage in revolutionary study with your fellow comrades. And finally, we have Iskra Books, which is an independent scholarly publisher, publishing original and diverse works of revolutionary theory, history, critique, and art, as well as edited collections, new translations, and critical republications of older works. And so here at Iskra, we seek to publish manuscripts grounded within the progressive and avant-garde dimensions of socialist and working class thinking, moving revolutionary and critical scholarship forward in innovative and practical ways, and pushing intellectual production outside of the academy and into the sphere of those actively engaged in real-world liberation struggles. Iskra publishes in critical times for a critical revolutionary audience of organizers, educators, and comrades engaged in the heart of the struggle. All of us who are, on this live right now. These are the people we're speaking to. We believe at Iskra Books that we have, in the words of Marx, have nothing to lose but our chains, and that we have a world to win, and we publish for that world. So you can find our work at iskrabooks.org and check us out at Peace, Land, and Bread. And I humbly thank you so much for tuning in and being with us for this revolutionary, productive talk with so many brilliant thinkers and like-minded individuals. So I will pass it off to Gabriel Rockhill, who's one of our panelists. Thank you.
Hey, actually, I think before Gabriel goes, I've been asked to say just a couple of words about the book and why I wrote it. I mean, first, again, thanks everybody for being here and engaging, thinking with me about these topics, and for everybody who made it happen. The panelists here is a very special group, I think, personally and politically. And just about this book quickly, I think, it's really the culmination I found of my latest, I don't know, actually my only kind of phase of research, thinking through really the relationship between pedagogy and politics, which are usually generally collapsed into each other. And so what makes something pedagogical? What makes it political? Are there antagonisms or contradictions between the two? But it's also spawned by like new interests, and in particular, aesthetics. And from this, I really draw heavily on Jennifer Ponce de Leon as well as Gabriel Rockhill, whose work, in their historical materialist approach to aesthetics, in particular, the idea that aesthetics does not equate to like quote unquote art, was very helpful. And another, like, as I read their work, a lot of things that I previously, engaged made sense. This is 1996 book by Don Mitchell, a Marxist geographer, called The Lie of the Land. And he talks about like how the California landscape are produced, right? Not only by the labor that shapes the land, but then also by the representation of labor as the landscape that sort of naturalizes and harmonizes it. And so the pedagogy and politics are different, right? Because politics is it's like a struggle for power to like realize a particular political program, which comes into being throughout the revolutionary process and after. And pedagogy is different though, because pedagogy is not organized towards like a particular, realizing a particular set of values or set of policies. But political pedagogy then, right, has to, like, where does that fit in? And that's really one of the things that I'm thinking through in the book. And why teaching the actuality of revolution? Well, I think that has to do with our conjuncture in the US in particular, and really the fact that there's been what Brian Becker calls like a break in ideological continuities in the people's struggles, right? In particular after the fall and dissolution of the Soviet Union, and then the sort of couple decades of unipolar U.S. imperialism, where the memory of the revolutionary struggles of of previous times was sort of broken as Marxism was really largely discredited. All these other ideologies stepped in to take their place, and so really, for me, I mean, Marxism isn't about what Marx said or blah, blah, blah. It's really about the actuality of revolution. It's really about the fact that we can't think about revolution as a possibility or whatever, but it's an actuality. It's something to be accomplished, and that has to guide us in every decision that we make sort of in the here and now. And then I think the only other thing I really want to say is I want to give a shout out to Daniela Chaparro, who made whose painting is on the cover of the book. And I think that's it. I'll let the panelists take it from here, but I'm very excited to hear what they have to say.
Hi, hi everyone. So I'm going to kick things off, and all of my comments are also comments shared with me by Jennifer Ponce de Leon. Unfortunately, she's sick and couldn't be here, but we've been talking about Derek's book. She shared her comments, and I decided to merge both of them. in order to kind of outline what we see as some of the principal strengths of the project, but also some of the fundamental questions that it raises for all of us. First and foremost, I want to congratulate Derek on the book. It's a great contribution. It raises a lot of really interesting questions, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation. In preparing the comments based on what Jennifer shared with me as well, I thought the best way to go about this would be to outline some of the fundamental themes of the book. And the very first one that I think comes across quite powerfully is the very nature of Derek's intellectual practice, which is highly commendable because you see the collective nature of everything that Derek does, right? This isn't a project in which he's come up with his new own special theory that nobody else has, and he has this idiosyncratic vocabulary for it. On the contrary, the book is woven through with a whole series of other conversations that Derek is part of, and it's a testament to a kind of collaborative intellectual ethos that I think is absolutely central to the Communist Project, and obviously to this book in particular. So I wanted to highlight that. But the other thing is the way in which Derek opens the book is quite interesting. He refers to the intellectuals in the global theory industry who abandoned, this is a quote, if they even ever endorsed the revolutionary project, right? So he clearly positions the project in opposition to the type of theory that tends to dominate a lot of the theory industry within the capitalist world, and in particular, the kind of radical edge of that industry, or what presents itself as the radical edge. And so I thought that this was an important element because it points to the ways in which so much contemporary theory within the capitalist world traffics in what I refer to as ABS theory, anything but socialism, meaning actually existing socialism, right? Socialism is an idea or a desire, that can be fine. But actually existing socialism is largely verboten or beyond the pale for at least the most prominent theorists within this particular industry. And what's important to note, of course, is that ABS theory is a BS theory. Because if you want to fight and win in the current moment of ecological degradation, the risks of nuclear annihilation, capitalist downturn, and everything else, you certainly can't fight and win with a BS theory. In Derek's case, he counterposes to this, as he just mentioned briefly, the actuality of revolution. And this is an extremely important idea to the book as a whole, of course, but it comes out of Lukács's reading of Lenin and is, of course, a theme in the larger global communist movement. And I think it's important to highlight, as Derek himself does in the book, that this isn't simply because we desire revolution or we want it subjectively. It's because there's already a world historical process that is underway. And Derek's book obviously situates itself within this deep socialist project that has been fighting and winning against capitalism through the course of the long 20th century, of course, but there are signs of this even earlier on. And so revolution is an actual reality. It's an ongoing reality, and it's one of the most pressing, if not the most pressing issue of our time, because the question that it raises is, will we destroy capitalism or will it destroy us and all or most of the biosphere? So the stakes of Derek's project are very, very high, and I commend him in situating his work precisely in opposition to those kind of radical recuperators who might want to sound as if they're revolutionary, but at the end of the day are not interested in supporting the most important world historical project at this point in time, and that is building a socialist world so that humanity and the larger biosphere can continue living, and hopefully not only continue living, but develop and flourish in various ways. Another point that is important in Derek's work is that ideology is not simply understood as a set of ideas or illusions that one might have, but he really foregrounds the sensory, perceptual, and aesthetic elements to ideology, meaning that ideology is about how we perceive the world, but also what we can and can't see, things to which we might remain tone deaf. And this raises a crucial pedagogical question, right? And I'm sure we've all had experiences like this if we do outreach or if we're just simply trying to convince someone of a particular political argument. You can argue until you're blue in the face, and in certain instances, rational argumentation is insufficient, right? And it's insufficient because certain people simply cannot see certain things or hear particular types of argumentation. And this, I think, is the connection in Derek's book to the centrality of the issue of pedagogy. Pedagogy can't just be about rational argumentation if ideology isn't simply a set of false beliefs. What he advocates for, this is using slightly different terminology, is what I would refer to as a kind of multidimensional pedagogy that deals with every different dimension of human existence and human experience. We have to connect to people's perceptions and how they're oriented in the world, as well as their affects, their desires. We have to try to tap into and educate them as an entire human being. And so one of the elements that comes out of Derek's work is a kind of perceptual pedagogy, if you will, teaching people how to see what they might not otherwise be capable of seeing. In the first chapter, Derek engages with the question of commodity fetishism in the first volume of Capital. And I think this is a really central part of his argument and what he's advancing, this kind of perceptual pedagogy, because commodity fetishism, of course, as Marx understood it, is a contradictory process at one level, because one is at once capable of seeing a commodity, and at the same time, that perception of a commodity is undergirded by an invisibilization or a rendering invisible of the social relations that produced that commodity. And it's that contradiction between being able to see something while at the same time being unable to see how that thing was produced that undergirds, of course, Marx's account of commodity fetishism. But then it also raises really fundamental questions about how ideology works. And so another leitmotif in the book is the relationship between the later Marx of the Capital and all of its volumes, and then the early Marx of the 1844 manuscripts, and then the work with Engels in the German ideology. Because a lot of what you get in the early Marx is a very refined attention to our sensory apparatus and the ways in which we see things without understanding the history of how our sensory apparatus has been composed and makes us see particular things and invisibilizes other things, as in the case of a commodity fetishism that would invisibilize the global social relations of production that produce a commodity like an iPhone or a computer that could be that would have a kind of enchanting power that one would want to buy or indulge in various ways with the gadgetry and whatnot, but that ultimately that invisibilizes the actual social relations that have produced it. And so part of Derek's work then raises this question of how, if ideology is, amongst other things, the ability to see certain things that themselves, that act of perception itself is founded on an inability to see the conditions that produce that vision in the first place, it recalled to me, at least in reading both an earlier version of this book and in the final product, the ways in which Marx and Engels describe the camera obscura of ideology in the German ideology. And that is that one of the things that ideology does is it takes the world and it turns it upside down, so that what we think we see is the opposite of reality. And the way that Marx and Engels describe this is that that inversion is very much like the inversion of the image on our retina. And so ideological inversion occurs in such a way that we can't actually see it happen. What that means is that the primary datum of our experience, what we first perceive, is ideological. It's not as if we see reality and then we put on some magical glasses and reality gets turned upside down. On the contrary, our very first perception of reality is ideologically composed in such a way that it inverts the very nature of reality. And so I'm sorry if this is a little bit philosophical or slightly abstract, bear with me, but I think that this allows us to see one of the fundamental moves that Derek makes in the book and why it's so important. And I'll use an example to illustrate this. There's a famous psychological experiment that George Stratton undertook in the early 20th century, and then the experiment was later reproduced by other psychologists. And that experiment consisted in fabricating a series of goggles that he wore 24
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for bearing with us. We just are experiencing some technical difficulties, but the wonderful theorization and political and pedagogical insights you just heard from were from Gabriel Rockhill, who is a philosopher, cultural critic, and activist. I just want to give him the space that he deserves, and all of the wisdom that he's bestowing upon us, and contextualize it with his current work. So he is the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop, and professor of philosophy at Villanova University. He's published 9 books as well as numerous scholarly and journalistic articles, including most recently A Counter History of the Present, Interventions in Contemporary Thought, and Radical History in the Politics of Art. So for more information, you can find his work at gabrielrockhill.com. So while we figure out the nitty-gritty of the tech-ish issues, I would like to introduce our next panelist, which is Summer Papachin, who's a second-year PhD student at Northwestern University. She studies and teaches in political theory and international political economy, one of my favorite topics, and researches in feminist theory and critical race theory. She's also written for Liberation School and Breaking the Chains magazine, a wonderful grassroots magazine and think tank for the working class struggle, and recently published a book chapter in bioinformational philosophy and post-digital knowledge ecologies. Summer organizes with the Anna for Ward 45 campaign in Chicago, where they're fighting against police brutality, fascism, and corruption. So thank you so much, and I will kick it off to Summer right now.
Hey everyone. Hopefully we can get Gabriel back on at some point after I'm done. But first of all, I'd like to say, thank you for having me here, Derek, and everyone else. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And I'll start by saying that I have been a student of Derek's at our undergrad college. We were together for about 3-4 years. And we were also comrades because we did a lot of political work together on campus, stirred up a lot of trouble. And in a way, we still work together now. And so in his book, Derek writes on, I forget what page 13, he writes, when learning from a teacher, the student brings the teacher's knowledge into their own outlook. It's just like, okay, fine, lame. You are internalizing the teacher's views. And it goes on, it says, but when being taught by a teacher, the student's life is interrupted as the teacher intervenes in the being of students through arranging educational materials, establishing relationships of trust, and cultivating spaces for unexpected encounters. So let me just say that, Derek definitely practices his own philosophy, because I know a lot of students, a lot of friends, actually dear friends, whose lives were interrupted by Derek, and mine too. And yeah, I'm honored to be here to be able to talk about this book. I was actually able to edit a draft of the book and help to, go through an earlier draft of it. And I will say that, reading the final book now, it's also beautiful. Shout out to a friend of mine, Danielle Chaparro, for the beautiful cover. I'll say that, the final book is something I want every single person in my life to read. Everyone I love, I want them to read it. And I'll start with one thing I like about it, and it's that, rewind. I'm in a PhD program, like it was introduced, and at a mainstream university, that does political science, and I study and teach in political science. And so I'm unfortunately very familiar with how Marx is being talked about in most US college campuses and most of the classrooms. And because of that, I really appreciated how Marx was treated in Derek's book, because it's not flattery, but I would say it's appreciation for complexity. It's compassion for a thinker's whole self. The book is very comfortable with all the contradictions in Marx's thought, like the tension between his own writings and like different parts of his work. And because, Marx at the end of the day was someone who was just like us, working through his own ideas and trying to understand reality like us. And that's really how the book approaches Marx, and is really, grounded in his tradition. And so I think that, anytime any scholar in political science talks about Marx, this is how I would like for them to orient themselves to him. I'll also say that the book is, I think, very helpful for educators and practitioners. And when I say educators, I mean like not just professional educators, like moms and mentors who, everyone is teaching someone something. But I also think like when it comes to professional educators, like people who teach preschoolers, like my mom, people who teach high schoolers, like some of my best friends, or even college age kids, I think the book is really helps us to reflect on our practice and on our lives and our relationship with students and what it means to be a teacher. The book isn't like a how-to guide and doesn't have tips and tricks, but it does something even better, perhaps, in that it helps you reflect and try to think what's your goal in the classroom and what are different ways in which you can even understand the act of teaching. I think for myself, at least, I got ideas about like what I would want to try in the classroom, even though the book never gave me any ideas. It just like prompted me to come up with them myself, if that makes any sense. And I think that that'll be a lot of people's experience with it. It's just, how he writes. Okay. And I also want to say that the book is very readable. It's a pleasure to read. Like every time that I was a little confused about a term, it was immediately defined. And that's something very important to me when reading and even when trying to write stuff myself. Like every term, like pedagogy, politics, educational forms versus content, whatever it may be, it was always defined. And I think that, that's important, and it makes it a pleasure to read. And then lastly, I'll end on a point about disability and how the book allows disability to permeate all through the book's philosophy, if that makes sense. I think a lot of people talk about ableism, this and that, and that's important, obviously, because, the system we live in disables people every day and it oppresses the disabled severely. However, there comes a point where we have to ask, how do we reformulate philosophy itself, like the way we see the world from the perspective of the disabled? Like, how do we reimagine very basic educational concepts? Like, what does it mean to understand something? What does it mean to study something? Da, da, da. To reimagine these very basic ideas from the perspective of the disabled. And I think that this book, after having read it a couple of times now, I think it's a really good example of that. And maybe I'm overstepping, but one example, I think, going off of what something Gabriel said, was like about seeing and perceiving, right? So like Derek defines the idea of art and the idea of teaching both as like seeing and not seeing, or better to put it, like seeing in alternative ways than the dominant way of seeing, for example, right? And that's kind of the role of a critical educator or a revolutionary artist. And then I'll end on a question for Derek, I guess, or just for anyone who would be have thoughts about it. And the question will probably irk you, Derek, because it's a little predictable. But I want to know what what you would think about a how-to guide follow-up to this book. Like this book is perfect as it is because it's philosophy. But what about like a follow-up with like tips and tricks? Because I would personally want to see that from somebody. For example, like what concrete means does a teacher use in a class to like enable their students to escape their disciplinary conditioning, from capitalism? Like what is it? What are the means that we use to do this? I think someone should write that book. I think that actually Derek has a lot of those answers to that just through his own practice and, teaching every day in and out. And I think a lot of other teachers have ideas too. So I would want to see everyone come together and write a book about the exercises, for what this stuff can look like in a classroom. And perhaps you can like reflect on if, that's something you even think is a good thing to do, or if it's, I don't know, collapses possibility in some way. I'm just curious. Okay, well, and on that, and I want to, thank the village of comrades that brought this book launch together, and thank everyone for attending on this Saturday afternoon, taking your time out, and then I'll pass it back over to our chair.
Thank you so much, Summer. That you're right. That would be an amazing book to put together as almost a how-to guide for almost like, the way that dialectical materialism is a living and breathing guide for how to concretely bring about revolutionary struggle. I think that in the classroom setting, that would be absolutely helpful for the teachers of our generations and going forward. And so now we'll go back to Gabriel Rockhill to continue his piece on the pedagogical link between politics and culture, and discussing the larger themes that go on with Derek's book. So thank you so much, and I will pass it on to Gabriel.
Yeah, sorry that I dropped out. The internet connection failed, but I'm glad that I'm back. I think I left off, I was talking about the perceptual pedagogy as one of the fundamental themes in Derek's book. And the image that I was left with and that I wanted to share with you that I thought was important is this goggle experiment that I mentioned was one in which George Stratton, a psychologist, fabricated goggles that made him perceive the world, everything in the world, upside down. And what was quite extraordinary about the experiment, which has been done and repeated since then, is how quickly he could acclimate himself and live in the world that was upside down, meaning that he could pour tea and write. And in later experiments, people with upside down goggles could ride bikes or go skiing. And so it demonstrates the malleability of perception and the ability on the part of human beings to actually live in an upside down world. And I think that what Derek's book is doing in its insistence on perceptual pedagogy is it's trying to train people who have been brought up in an upside down world, meaning a world structured by ideology, a world where they don't see actual reality. It's trying to train them to invert that world and see reality for what it is. And that art and culture play an absolutely central role in that. So another leitmotif in the book is the weapon, and very important weapon, of class struggle that is art and culture. Because art and culture can train us to see not only the world differently, but to see reality instead of an ideologically inverted version of reality. And this, of course, has been so important to the way in which the capitalist ruling class has imposed a certain image of the world. I'll just bring two examples to the fore that I think are important. One is that 5 mega corporations control over 90% of what all US Americans read, watch, or listen to. So the perceptual apparatus is controlled by the capitalist ruling class and only 5 corporations therein, which is an awesome amount of power to indoctrinate people. Another important example of this is the extent to which the Department of Defense, as well as organizations like the CIA and the FBI, have been very deeply involved in cultural production in Hollywood as well as in TV production. In fact, there's a recent book, relatively recent, called National Security Cinema that points out that 814 films and 1,947 TV titles have been supported by the Department of Defense, and the support by the Department of Defense gives them full censorship rights over every one of those screen products. And when I say that number of films and those TV titles, some of those TV titles are long-running TV shows, which would only count for 1 in that count. So TV shows like 24, Homeland, and others. What this means, in short, is that the capitalist ruling class knows full well, and has known for a very long time, that art and culture are absolutely essential weapons of class warfare from the top down. And what you get in Derek's work is the insistence on aesthetics as a form of perceptual pedagogy, amongst other things, as a weapon that has been used, of course, by the general working class, but that also needs to be further developed. And one central aspect of that, and I think that this overlaps with some of the general themes of this event, is that it's not simply sufficient for an individual artist to produce individual works of art that would contest the kind of dominant culture industries and the dominant ideology. If we want real power, then we have to go after the entire system of cultural production, cultural circulation, and consumption, because that's what's controlled by the capitalist ruling class. They not only own the means of production, they own the means of cultural production. and circulation and consumption. And so it's wonderful that we've brought together such a broad panoply of organizations to do this event, precisely because it's a testament to the struggle over culture and the need to develop our own means of cultural production, circulation, and consumption, which is being done by Iskra Books, by Peace, Land, and Bread, by the Hampton Institute, by the People's Forum, by Liberation School, which Derek plays an absolutely central role in, by the Critical Theory Workshop, by the other co-sponsors of this event. And so I think it's interesting that in Derek's own theorization, you have these elements that themselves are manifest in his own intellectual practice, but also in the event that we're currently participating in. Because ultimately what we need to do is, just as there's a capitalist cultural apparatus, meaning there's a capitalist control over the means of cultural production, circulation, and consumption, we need to develop a socialist cultural apparatus. And of course, this is already being developed in places like Cuba and China and Vietnam and elsewhere. But within the capitalist core, we have to do it in such a way that we also need to navigate all of the contradictions of what it means to control at a certain level the means of cultural production, while nonetheless being ensnared within capitalist social relations. We have to find ways of dealing with those contradictions, confronting them head on, solving problems that can be quite difficult to solve, like financing, right? Like the fact that you will rely on wages for various things. And so I would also like to encourage everyone who is participating in this event to give thought to how they can individually and collectively contribute to this important project of developing even more this apparatus of cultural production, circulation, and reception that's in the hands of the people instead of in the hands of the parasites of the people. And this is one of the things that Derek's, not only his book, but for that matter, Derek's theoretical practice more generally, because the book is an outcome of so much of the collective pedagogical work that Derek's been doing for decades at this point in time. And so the last point that I'd like to highlight, and this is, I can phrase it a little bit in terms of a question, because it's a very live question for me as well. It's a question not only for Derek, but for everybody else who is participating in this event. And that is that Derek, I think very importantly, foregrounds in the book the way in which ideology has to do not only with cognition, but also with sense perception, how we perceive the world. And this reminded me of a very important text by Mao Zedong that's called On Practice. And one of the things that Mao does in this text is that he demonstrates that there are these two levels, and a third one I'll get to in a moment, sense perception and understanding, but there's a very important distinction between the two. And that is that you can, through art and culture, for instance, teach people how to see the world differently. You can teach them to see imperialism. You can teach them to see homelessness or poverty or the degradation of human life under the US healthcare system, for instance. But to see something can often be very different than to understand something. And what Mao insists on, it's a point that I have really taken to heart as of late, is that sense perception and an ideological reconfiguration of our sense perception, teaching us to see the world differently and to see the world more correctly, needs to be connected to a higher level of understanding. Because at the level of understanding, you can not only see something like injustice, but you can understand how it's produced. You can not only kind of be trained to perceive exploitation, but you can understand and know where exploitation comes from. So the question that I have is whether or not Derek or others would agree that understanding actually operates at a higher level than sense perception, because it's about having a systemic apprehension of where our perceptions come from, how they're produced, and that ultimately, and this is the last part of the question, is that Mao connects this to a third level, which is the level of practice. So ultimately, there's a dialectical relationship between sense perception, understanding, which is at a higher level because it allows us to see the system of relations that produces our perceptions. But ultimately, practice is the highest level because something is true, not because it seems true to our understanding and we can have a coherent account or an internally coherent account of something. It's true because our system of understanding can be tested in practice and transformed based on that practice. So there's a constant feedback loop between understanding and practice. And I take it that some of Derek's work is a kind of great contribution, because when you think of Derek's more broad kind of theoretical practice, he's someone who's embedded in practice, the practice of pedagogy, the practice of political organizing, and it informs all of the intellectual work that he does. And so I'm curious the extent to which this Mao's description of this kind of dialectics could be mapped onto or inform this perceptual pedagogy that I was talking about earlier, meaning that, and this would be my final comment, that we need to not only train people to see the world differently and more correctly, but connect it to a higher level of understanding, but never remain at the level of pure cognition. Connect that cognition to practice, because of course the whole point isn't simply to interpret the world or to see the world differently, it's to transform the world. And I think that Derek's book is a wonderful invitation to all of us to be invested in this dialectics of perception, understanding, and ultimately social and political transformation. So I'll turn it over to the next speaker with that.
I feel so energized. Thank you so much, Summer and Gabriel, for your beautiful insights. I think, as any other comrade would agree, hearing the voices and perspectives of so many brilliant thinkers just gives me more confidence and desire to bring about this eventual inevitable world that exists outside of the market system. So thank you so much for your insights. I particularly loved how you described the perceptual apparatus of our current society being controlled by, 5 major mega corporations, and how, capitalist a capitalist cultural and social apparatus must be met with its socialist counterparts. So thank you so much for that. And on that note of Mao Zedong, I love that article. I love that piece on practice. I also encourage our viewers to read Combat Liberalism. Just quite another extraordinary piece of scholarship that encourages us as comrades to move towards beyond pure cognition and into concrete social and ecological transformation. So thank you so much. Next up, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, which is Michelle Kurta. She is an educator, facilitator, and new mother working in the dynamic intersections between teaching, learning, healing, and liberation. Through her current collaborative project of Meaning Makers Collective, Michelle engages and amplifies insights and practices for disrupting the explicit and unconscious patterns of systemic inequity, and attending to the wisdom of our bodies in service of personal and collective healing and transformation. Michelle earned a BA in Peace Studies from Goucher College, a master's degree in depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute, and an MED in urban education and single subject teaching credential from UCLA's teacher education program. Michelle taught language arts at the School for Visual Arts and Humanities in the LAUSD, and has worked as a peer coach and facilitator of trauma-informed and healing-centered practices with K through 12 educators. So after that energizing talk, I would love to keep moving this forward with Michelle Kurta. Michelle, let's kick us off with another amazing piece.
Yeah, wow, it's so interesting to listen and integrate and then have to speak. So I think I didn't really plan exactly where I was going to begin. I hoped that it would come to me, but I'm thinking it feels important to me to say that it's a really unexpected thing for me to be here speaking on this panel for, in multiple ways, but it was a little blip in my bio, but I gave birth about 4 months ago. And this is not the book that I expected I was going to be reading during this postpartum time in my life. And I'm so grateful that Derek and I connected and that the invitation came to be here. Because I think this, reading this book has done something which I was curious about how I was going to do, which is hold open this postpartum space, rather than, have the experience of, work and advice and these, influx of what I'm supposed to do to make sure that my child is going to advance through these, the appropriate developmental stages, which, all felt like it was going to completely foreclose the really radical space of having given birth. So I hope it's okay that I kind of speak to this not from a theoretical perspective, but just from this particular moment that I'm situated in. I told Derek when I read just the introduction to the book, it immediately brought up this postpartum kind of space, and I think it also is important for me to mention that it made me think, the most recent explicitly educational spaces I've been in were these birth preparation classes that my partner and I were in, and other spaces where I was, speaking to other pregnant people, speaking to birth workers, trying to navigate and prepare for an experience that is going to be incredibly, incredibly engaging in an immersive way, in a sensory way. And I can see, there's a way that in reading this book, it really made me reflect on the ways that, not only that we're, prepared for an experience like giving birth, the stories and the narratives that are told about what's actually happening to the body, what your role as the birthing person is. I think one of the things I wanted to, that it's illuminating for me is I spoke a lot and I learned a lot and just talked a lot with other people about trying to have some kind of say in the birthing environment. And I was privileged enough to be able to give birth outside of a hospital. But I'm just thinking about the sensory environment of pregnancy and birth, and how the experience itself is one of such potential rupturing of a perceptual ecology, and how I would want to say the guides, the midwives, the doctors, whoever is in that space, are really performing like a teaching function in a lot of ways. And so I guess I don't have a theory worked out, but I have a lot of curiosity about the teaching that happens when, it's not necessarily the teacher creating the moment of, or the disruption or the possibility of unlearning or opening the space through pointing, as Derek talks about in the book. But that there's a physiological, in this case, a physiological thing happening that is rupturous, and how to prepare ourselves as teachers in those moments, and in those really I'm speaking about the experience of giving birth, but I also think about the experience of becoming disabled, the experience of injury or sickness, or any of these experiences that kind of affect a caretaking relationship, which isn't always talked about as teaching. But I'm thinking, and I'm wondering, and I want to I feel really curious about how to develop these capacities for these pedagogical moves that that Derek's describing in the book, in people and in spaces where we're not, we're not there, at least, we should be. I believe that we should be talking about politics in birthing spaces, but it's not being explicitly talked about. So I think that's where my thoughts are right now. Reading the book really, from this moment in my life, I feel like it has, like I said in the beginning, has allowed me to hold open, the space of unknowing, of specifically this concept of listening for what we don't know. I think that the experience of getting to know, this new being in our lives, and listening to the sounds, just like feeling the movements, and really, recommitting to a practice of listening for what I don't know. So much more to say. It's kind of, I'm like, I can't believe I decided to talk about this thing of all the things, because, but this is what's here right now. And I'm actually really, curious to see where that conversation might go in the future. And I do want to say also, as an educator, a teacher, whatever, all these other things that were mentioned in the bio, I'm so glad that Summer brought up the idea of a follow-up. I would personally love to be involved in in conversations and opportunities to just like share stories about what it looks like in practice in different settings, to engage in these pedagogies. So I'm grateful to be here, and humbled by being asked, and just really enjoy the opportunity also to be able to celebrate Derek and his work.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm so humbled by the diverse experiences and perspectives that are just in this virtual room right now. The links between politics, pedagogy, and parenthood are certainly a complex one, and that sounds in and of itself like an amazing book to explore. I feel like as we're working through these concepts, we're figuring out new sites of academic exploration. So thank you so much for your insights, Michelle. We're going to move on to our next panelist, Kim Smith. She is a mom, popular educator, organizer, cultural worker, Southern scholar, Trekkie, and up-and-coming theologian. Born and raised in West Columbia, South Carolina, Kim loves reading, studying, and learning, and redefining what and who is an intellectual and what's considered theory. So I humbly ask Kim to bless us with her insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for having me, and I always thank you so much, Comrade Derek, for allowing me to be a part of this world. I think it's really important to kind of ground and frame what world I come from. I'm not from a PhD background or a typical, teacher in a classroom. I come from a very different world, and this is a different world. So I always thank Derek for pulling me into a different world, and challenging me about pedagogy and challenging me about theory and pushing me out of my comfort zone. I feel so blessed to have you as a comrade. So as I've been trying to, making my way through Derek's book and going through it and reading it, I kept thinking about several things. And like the first thing that always stands out to me about Derek's writing style is it's beautiful. It's always poetic and beautiful, and it flows in a way that makes me forget that I'm engaging with an academic text that is honestly, sometimes I feel like above my level of usual engagement or my education. But I always get to go in and ride the wave of poetry, which I love so much. And I thank Derek for that. And that being said, even though the text was challenging, I was able to latch onto that tone that he uses and the rhythm that it was written in, and continuously flow through the text. And so many questions and thoughts came to mind while I was trying to study this text. And I want to just really point out that I said study. I didn't say read, because I think that this is a text that needs to be deeply studied. I'll even go as far as to say that Derek has written a book similar to biblical texts that need to be approached using the exegetical method, and a particular hermeneutic. So once I began to find my footing, exploring all the twists and turns that Derek's writing took me on, the text is beautiful and it's a theoretical masterpiece. And I want to just really ask Derek, who was the audience when writing this? I know Derek well enough, I feel like, to know that his writing is never focused on just these hallowed halls of academia or this one realm, or people who are professional educators. I think all of these people in all these different sectors are vital to revolutionary struggle and the struggle for liberation. We need everyone from every sector. But I want to ask, I kind of want to ask Derek, or just really start to think about how else and where else this can be used. I know that this was a tool that is written to be wielded as a tool in revolutionary, the revolutionary process and the revolutionary educational process, which needs to be and will be led by the working class, and not necessarily just the working class that is already familiar with Marx, Lenin, and Freire. But as you're writing, Derek, do you think about that class or the sector of the class that are students of Septima Clark and their mothers and their grandmothers and their pastors and their Sunday school teachers and the woman on the corner that sells candy? Those are the educators that we need to get the text into this, we need to get this text into their hands, but not just get it into their hands, because as I was delving deeper into thought, which again, I always want to say how happy that Derek's writing forces me out of my comfort zone and forces me to reflect. I found myself reflecting on how I felt when reading and where I was when I started. And I went through a lot of emotions when reading this. And I think that's the mark of a brilliant theoretical text, a text that challenges you and forces you to reflect and not just inform you, but to make you feel all the feelings, even if it's annoyance, because I did get annoyed with Derek a lot of times in this book, or confusion. And so I wanted to just really ask the final question, Derek, how are you planning on expanding the ways in which this book can be engaged in? I believe that a text like this can be used by seasoned organizers as well as the parent who is just trying to figure out how to combat the capitalist white supremacist educational system that their kids are exposed to. How do you make theoretical concept in this book easier to grasp, whether you're studying this in your local library or while you're sitting in the car rider line at school pickup? Because it needs to be studied, but engaged in a particular way. So just given all of the elements of the book and all of the beautiful different descriptions and destination and the journey that you took us on, what is your vision for this book? What is your vision for other organizers to take this book and begin to close the gap between academia and the community? How do we ensure, or how do you want to ensure that people won't leave this text feeling less than, but feeling more? Feeling like they are revolutionary and revolution is possible, and understanding the key role that education plays in the revolutionary process. How do organizers not, quote, dumb it down? I hate that phrasing, but that was the only thing I could think of, but make it plain and also create from this. Use this text as a start, as a base, as the art that it is to build their own pedagogical tools from this. So Derek, what is your vision for what's next for this text? Thank you.
These are such wonderful questions. Thank you so much, Kim. I'm still pondering on your last question and how do we leave this book feeling more, not less? And I think that's a question that many of us in the academic community, face in terms of reconciling, these deeply complex intellectual questions, but then at the root of it, turning to practice and moving beyond that pure cognition that Gabriel was talking about earlier. So thank you so much. Lastly, I want to introduce Derek Ford, the author we've come together today to celebrate. But as I introduce him and as Derek, tells us about his outlook on all of these ideas, I want to encourage everyone who's watching live to drop questions in the comment section. We will have time for a Q&A afterwards, so please feel free to put any lingering thoughts, ideas, questions, anything of that sort, so that we can really make this a community event with the rich experiences and intellectualizations of everyone in this circle, not just the panelists, not just us, but everyone online who is engaging in live time. And so I'll take it away. So Derek is a teacher, educational theorist, and organizer, currently working as an associate professor of education, studies at DePaul University. They've authored 8 books, including Encountering Education, Elements for Marxist Pedagogy, and Politics and Pedagogy in the Post-Truth Era, Insurgent Philosophy and Praxis. In addition to their popular writing, which has appeared in outlets such as Block Agenda Report, Monthly Review, and the Ornico Tribune, they hosted the podcast series Reading Capital with Comrades as well, diving into Marx's original texts on capital. And so Ford is also the editor of Liberation School, an associate editor of Post-Digital Science and Education, as well as an organizer with the Indianapolis Liberation Center and Answer Coalition. So last but not least, Derek, take it away with your wisdom and intellectual theorizations. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, everybody, for your reading and your responses and reactions and questions and interpretations. They're very helpful. I think there's a couple of things that I definitely want to respond to because I think that they're very important. And I'll try to sort of link them together in a way that's as organic as possible. But I think in response to Gabriel's point about the sense perception and then understanding and then practice, I think one thing is that right now, like, the reason why I privilege sensory perception in this book is because, like, how many more critiques of capital do we need? And I mean, obviously we need more, and we need more refined ones, and we need to explain those to people, right? But it's like, in terms of like whatever the global theory industry wants to pick up, it wants to there's a sort of limitation to that, right? And there's a way in which, like, I don't know, potentially even like revolutionary scholarship can fit into the circuits of capital. And so I think that there's an element of the conjuncture, but I like that there's a dialectic there between sense, understanding, and praxis, because ultimately that's where that's the task of, sort of, in a sense, that's the task of the teacher, right? Which to me might respond to Kim's question in terms of like the audience, right? The audience for this book is not necessarily like other teachers per se. I mean, it's really people who are engaged in popular or political education or even organizing, who might not think of themselves as educators and as teachers. And when that happens, right, then our received or preconceived notions of teaching and education, we just sort of graft those onto, political experiences. So wanting to sort of make that distinction between pedagogy and politics, and the aesthetic is sort of a nexus between the two. And I think that the main problem today, at least in my experience and in the US, is that, like, the idea obviously that we can rebel and resist is always present, because that's been present as long as there's oppression, right? There's always resistance. But the idea that we can actually, like, take power and reshape the world in the interests of the exploited and the oppressed of the world, that's what we really need to, like, rejuvenate our belief in, right? And that's the actuality of revolution. And something that Althusser talks about as, he says there's like 2 ways of thinking, right? Or scientific thinking. One is basically you just see, like, history as the inevitable result of the thing that came before it, and as the conclusion to all of that. And then there's the other way of thinking, which is the Marxist way of doing science or thought, which is basically, it starts from the fact to be accomplished, right? The actuality of revolution. And it sees the present moment as nothing more than, like, an assemblage of previously accomplished facts, but without any teleology or like linearity. In other words, without any like, evolutionary or developmental stages going between them, right? Because ultimately, like, and that's why I appreciate Althusser, is that he really wants to reclaim complexity and heterogeneity within communist practice. And for me, that's what I've always found so interesting about Marx, and why I've always thought that Marxism, which is more than just Marx, of course, the Marxist tradition has been able to spread throughout the globe to inform and arm, in addition to, of course, the socialist states offering crucial support for those national liberation and socialist struggles, so many different places, because ultimately historical materialism is historical and material. So it's going to adapt depending on, our circumstances. So it's a living, and breathing doctrine. And I think that there's also a difference that I posit between understanding and thinking, right? Because understanding is when I've like brought, I sense things and I've read things or whatever, and I sort of bring it into my own cognition. But then there's the process of thinking, which I think is like not emphasized enough, which is the sort of experience of thought itself, right? Where you're studying in your own mind without any sort of predetermined conclusions or outcomes. And in a sense, I think this is kind of the impossible but also magical task of teachers, wherever they may be, right? In whatever like, division of labor or whatever they might be, is that the teacher, like, for education to be liberatory, it can't just be open, like do whatever you want to do, right? But neither can it be like closed, right? Like, here's the ultimate outcome. And so what I'm thinking of, like, the contribution is really that education, like Marxist philosophy produces like theses, right? And like they're weapons in a fight that like, how do you figure out if a theory is right or not? Well, in practice, you can't like figure that out through mathematical proofs. And then science is something that produces knowledge, even though Marxist science, the knowledge is continually reproduced. But then Marxist education for me is really about the experience of that thinking as it's happening, the experience that the world is and can be otherwise, basically like unlearning capital sensorial regime or perceptual ecology, by which happens whenever that which is familiar seems strange all of a sudden, right? Whenever that which we thought was like timeless or whatever, right, all of a sudden seems like, oh wait, this is very historical. There are precise reasons why this is so, right? There's historical reasons. Everything is a result ultimately of production and struggle, which I think in turn kind of speaks to one of Curta's questions, which I really appreciated. I mean, all the speakers, but especially how you responded to it as the postpartum era as like a void or a gap, right? Because ultimately, that's the thing that I think political pedagogy has to respect, because is basically the void or the gap between the world as it is and the revolution, right? If you close down that void, if you suture over it, then you basically like it's all political, right? And there's no actual pedagogical experience. And so the pedagogical aspect is really about encountering unforeseen and unexpected and chance materials, right, that are arranged in a particular way by a teacher to basically help us wonder, right? And wonder is educational, that's pedagogical. But wonder on its own is kind of abstract, right? And ahistorical, which is why wonder for me always has to be linked in this project with the actuality of revolution, the fact to be accomplished. And so I also like the connection with childhood, because that's something I thought about a lot, right? Having been a child myself. Of course, I don't have children per se, but childhood isn't just like a particular stage of like the human's development, right? It's always with us. It comes out in those moments when like we find ourselves without words, without the ability to like make sense of something, when something disturbs our sense making and our previous thinking. For me, that's really childhood, right? Interrupting, right, the adult life. And then I think that the other thing is that rupture, and I make this clear, right? So learning, for those who, haven't read the book or whatever, is basically like a process that's always predetermined by an end goal, right? It's only because I know what like it looks like to write a good paper that I can like evaluate your progress along the way and say, okay, yeah, you did 75% of it. You're, 90% there, 100% there. And learning is really about bringing things into our own understanding, right? And unlearning. And so through learning, really, and in our conjuncture, like we basically view education as an economic transaction, knowledge as a commodity. We view ourselves as individuals, and end up, like individualizing our own desires and ambitions because we have to differentiate ourselves, in the competitive like labor market, global labor market. But unlearning is different in that what it really does is it's about, I do take up the definition of teaching as like a pointing to something, right? And unlearning is about facilitating breakdowns that don't close or solve the void between like the present and the revolution to be accomplished, but helps us experience that void. And so therefore interrupts capital's drive for like constant, fast, sense making and is rather about experiencing the limit of knowledge and understanding, right? Which prevents the accumulation of knowledge. And so just a couple of other things, if I have time, and just feel free to come interrupt me if you want me to stop. But I think the other thing was sense, and I'd say this early on, but in the book, but it's a very minor point, which is Tyson E. Lewis influences this work a lot. And for him, educational politics isn't about changing consciousness, but it's about, the pre-cognitive experience of perceptual foreplay, right? But for me, it is also about, consciousness and ideas. And this is why I think that Marx's, break with the Hegelians, Marx and Engels' break with the Hegelians is so important because from the 1844 manuscripts where Marx basically endorses, the Hegelian idea and Feuerbach's idea of, sensuous certainty, then in 1845 to 46, when they wrote the manuscripts, which were not published for a while later, they reject that. And they're like, there's no such thing as sensuous certainty, right? Because like our senses are historically produced, right? That which we sense, how we sense, what we don't sense are all historically produced. And of course, I think pedagogically produced, right? I mean, so much of our education is about like, look here, don't look there, listen to this, don't listen to that. Like touch this, don't touch that, don't lick that, right? And it's really about teaching us like what to do with each of our senses, and attributes a particular sensuous capacity to a particular like organ or part of the body, right? Which is why, sound, I give this example early on, and there's some other parts in the book about sound and listening, but sound we associate with the ear, right? Because we're all wearing earphones and I'm listening to this or whatever. But before the introduction and widespread availability of the record or the phonograph, listening wasn't really about the ear, right? It was visual, and it was felt, right? It was touched. And in fact, when record players first came out, there's an article from like a 1923 journal about this guy, using record players when he's teaching. And he's like, you got to put the record player in the back of the room because or else people will just stare at it, right? Because at the time, that's what you did, because music wasn't separated from its like spatial location, and its social context and its place and its time. The phonograph, the record allowed that to happen. And so what people would do is they would just literally stare at the record players, right? Which teaches us, one, that our senses are historically produced, right? And change over time, but also that there's no, like, we can't isolate or attribute any particular sense to any particular organ or part of the body or sensation, right? And so that in itself, I think, is an opening up of the sensuous, world around us and the different ways in which we can sense things. And then, of course, when we know that and we can name that, then we sense it differently, right? We sort of like I see something and I'm able to make sense of it in a different way, rather, right? If that makes sense. And a couple of other things, if I can, and again, just like you can put in the chat to shut up or, just come on and interrupt me. But in terms of, Marx, my engagement with Marx, as Summer talked about, I think the more and more I read Marx, and it's not out of like, I have to, he's right about everything or whatever. And in fact, like he's constantly saying like, oh, I used to think this, but now this is true. Now I think this, right? I used to think that the socialist revolution or the socialist revolution in the advanced capitalist countries would be the thing that, sparked revolutions elsewhere. And then he later says, actually, no, anti-colonial revolutions, anti-slavery revolutions could be the spark that ignites the socialist struggle in Britain. So he's constantly changing his mind. He's constantly thinking. But one of the things that really stuck out to me recently is, the way that in academia, it's always like Marx's theory of primitive accumulation, but Marx never talks about that. He talks about so-called primitive accumulation, right? And really the reason it's so-called is because, so primitive accumulation, it's like basically the way that the bourgeois political economists said, capitalism came to be, which is that one group, smart, frugal, forward thinking, saves their money, becomes capitalist. Another group, me, lazy, dumb, wasteful, becomes the worker, right? And so, Marx corrects that in terms of where capital came from. And the original capital came from Britain, right? Which is, slavery, the slave trade in the U.S. in particular, the racialized slave trade in the U.S., colonialism, the genocide of indigenous peoples, the looting and the conquest of peoples and territories, and so on and so forth. But, he says it appears as primitive, right? Because it's the prehistoric stage of capital. But he says it's a vicious circle because, of course, capital continues to do this, right? And capital is like an ongoing process. It's never like finalized, right? It's dynamic. And so as I'm reading this section again, I'm just like thinking about this notion of the vicious circle and how really what capital does is it tries to present a narrative in which, right, there was a time before capitalism and then these things happened and now we're in capitalism, right? This sort of linear stage. But what Marx is actually doing is he's saying like, look, this is basically capital has to continually reproduce itself and its origins. And so what he's doing in the book, as I read it, is an aesthetic pedagogy that's helping us sense the gaps in the present, right? The capital tries to cover over, which is why so many of the readings that dismiss it or whatever, I think really function to ultimately like inhibit our belief in revolution, and also to, get us wedded to a sense of time. And it really is capital's abstract temporality that does that. And I think two more things is that one, in Peter McLaren's review, which I appreciated because it was critical, he says that this is the first book he's read of mine that actually has a good ending. I think that that's probably true. And at the end, he kind of says that, like Derek has this united front kind of approach to thinking and to organizing, but there's also some sectarianism in the beginning of the book. And so I think that that's actually true and a bit of a contradiction, where basically calling out some of the original like founders of critical pedagogy, which were kind of part of this anti-communist break in the 1980s, along with neoliberalism that accommodated it. Like there was a time when that needed to be sort of like polemicized against and called out. But I think that, that time might have passed and that we're in a very different situation now in which socialism is very popular. More and more people are like taking to the streets and so on and so forth, which also, I'm down to do like the conclusion of the book for me is a kind of model for how to practice this idea of perceptual mapping, where we map out as much as we can about our totality in which we exist, right? Which is like impossible, literally, right? You can't map it all out. It's always changing, and it's also global, right? And it's historical, the whole history behind it. And then, but through doing that kind of mapping, then we learn something about the totality that determines us, but we also unlearn it, right? By sort of remapping it in a different way. And so learning and unlearning, I think, should have to be blocked together, right? I don't think that one should be prioritized over the other. The problem is that historically in Marxist and the revolutionary traditions associated with communism, content has been the main thing rather than the pedagogical form. So I'm trying to compensate for that. But there might be times when content takes priority, right? And where that is more important. And one final thing has to do with this notion of rupture that Curta brought up, which is that there's a point, I should have made it more at the end of the book, or at the end of one of the chapters, but you know, to privilege rupture and like breaks and breakdowns and making the, you know, all this stuff, like it can come across as like, okay, yeah, but like I mean, you know, I think like there's already too much rupturing in my life. Like my life is constantly breaking down, you know, like I never know if I'm gonna have healthcare or not, or like if I'm gonna have a job or not. But the thing about unlearning is that it actually creates a rupture within that allows like past times, you know, present times and future times to come and be felt, in which like tradition, for example, isn't something of the past, but we experience it as something that is still living. So I, of course, have more to say, but I've talked long enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek. I appreciate all of your insights and critiques, and just everyone who has contributed to this talk today. Just hearing all of the theoretical thinking and perceptual mapping, in your words, that occurs in everyday discussions like this is just so powerful to see, and allows us to move forward in our revolutionary praxis and thinking. And so on that note, I would like to turn it to Q&A panel. I'm looking through the comments right now in the live chat. And it looks like someone, Michael Hughes, says that he's very interested in the question of finding ways to simplify leftist and Marxist thought. He also says we also need modern critique of capitalism that doesn't solely rely on traditional Marxism. And we need to find ways to modernize Marxism to fit a modern world. Before I open that up, I would highly recommend this one piece by Walter Rodney. It's called Marxism and National Liberation. I think that's where Michael, if you're still in the Zoom room, to turn to that text, because it delves a lot into how traditional Marxism has, you know, in different revolutionary contexts and movements have been almost morphed into apply to the specific historical conditions and social meanings within a certain people, a certain point in time. So I'd really emphasize that article. But just opening it up to the rest of the panel, any last thoughts or last remaining lingering questions that we have for Derek, or really anyone on the panel? Oh, I just saw in the chat, Salma Alam asks, kind of wondering what you mean when you say wonder if historical.
Is a historical. Yeah.
Oh, does someone want to wait? Hold on.
Yeah, so earlier I said that wonder on its own is kind of like abstract and ahistorical. And what I mean by that, Comrade Salma, who I also know from DePauw, one of Summer's co-leaders of the socialist group, is that basically like wonder on its own, like, okay, wondering is fine, but for it to be political, it has to be like guided towards some kind of end, right? Not in order to reach that end, because then you're not wondering, you're just trying to reach that end, right? But rather wondering with this sort of end goal that's present, but not determining everything that you're thinking about, because or else you just close down possibility, right? And this, I think, also speaks to like Michael's question, which is like, one, you know, for me, Marxism doesn't name like a body of thought, right? There's like, I say that there's like, you know, I'm all for like 1, 2, 3, many Marxisms, because there are, right? And it has to evolve, because that's the whole point of it, right? Is like, you know, Marx never made predictions, like, or he was never like, this is exactly how it's going to happen, you know? He was constantly changing his mind, and that's precisely the reason why I think it carries so much, has historically informed really some of the, you know, broadest transformations in the world. Although, of course, before Marx, I mean, he says it himself, like he didn't discover the class struggle, right? He says that very early on, like class struggles existed as long as like societies have been divided, right, between classes. And so for Marx, class isn't actually just like about workers and owners, right? Class is an expansive thing. In the Communist Manifesto, he calls it a camp of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, right? And also they're processes, right? So they're camps rather than like, you know, like empirical categories, which is important because Marx, you know, and the communist tradition also considers, you know, oppressed nationalities, colonized peoples, of course, as part of the proletariat, even if there, you know, there's other categories too. And then I think that, you know, I think that Marxism should be and is broken down in many accessible ways to people. This kind of speaks to something, Kim, maybe you have a response to this, but in terms of like getting these ideas out there, one of the reasons why I had so many people like read drafts of the book is because like, all right, you don't know this literature, like, does this make any sense to you? And the feedback I got was very, very helpful. So I think it's like, you know, it's accessible, but it's also coming from like the traditions that, you know, I've been invested in. And so my hope is really that, like, you know, as I said, I'm down to make, like, help collectively make kind of like a, you know, a set of strategies or tactics or whatever. But I think that, you know, really really the audience is like political organizers, you know, as well as like people who are interested in politics and who might be interested in like aesthetics or just it for whatever kinds of reasons, right? But any other responses from the?
Yes, we have two questions. I'll just pose this to the whole group. Chronic YT Watcher asks, do you guys think reading Marx books is a waste of time? I'm confused with the post-Marx Marxism, and it is getting worse after Gabriel criticized Zizek. I don't know what to rely on. So I guess wondering, I guess, the applicability of traditional Marxism and how we can use Marxism today.
Well, I'm gonna let Gabriel respond, but I will just say, one, it has to be collective. You know, like that we need teachers. I need teachers to point me to the right and the relevant content, right? And that's the you know, like who should I read? I don't really know. You know, like what should I do in the struggle? I don't know, because I don't know the struggle as an individual. I have to be part of an organization and part of a collective to know my place in it, to know like, oh, this, you know, whatever, even to like create. So really what I'm trying to do is create a common set of concepts, right? And sort of ideas that we can use as organizers to reflect on these processes, right? And you know, part of that comes also in the interest in aesthetics comes from, you know, my work on and around and with disability, right? And the way in which something that I talk about in the book, it's kind of, I mean, there's a couple of points about it in the book, but, you know, one is that, I mean, what basically like one, Nirmala Aravelos makes the important argument that all oppressed groups in general, right, have been oppressed based on their proximity to like the disabled, right? So women have been oppressed because they're irrational or whatever, right? And so then the question for those movements is like, well, do we try to like say and prove that we are this type of, you know, fully human, or do we like fight for our own way of being? And so one of the reasons why I got interested in aesthetics is because they're like, I mean, there's this video of Mel Baggs that I showed in my class, one of my classes, like all the time, called In My Own Language. Baggs was an autistic person, and it's a really, really fantastic video that basically is like, look, I can like do all these things. I can touch, I can look, I can smell, and like, you know, in their own language, they're actually like constantly communicating with the world around them. But when they focus on just one thing, that's when they're like, you know, they're becoming human, right? And they're like, you know, they're becoming like whatever. Like it's actually when they like limit their communication, limit the senses, right, and limit what they're sensing, that happens. So, anyways, Gabriel, I don't know if you want to, I mean.
I could say a word or two. I mean, I think that, Marxism is the collective science of human liberation that is constantly being adapted to new and different circumstances. And in that regard, when you read Marx and the Marxist tradition in the broad sense of the term, you're tapping into this theoretical project that is trying to map and understand the world so that we can transform it, because it's part of a practical enterprise as well. So it's absolutely worth reading Marx and books within the Marxist tradition, the Walter Rodney that was referenced earlier, but then there's a lot of other work within this tradition that can give us a clear sense of what it means to understand the world in order to transform it. And there's other versions of, I wouldn't call them Marxism, it's Marxian in the sense that there are discourses that borrow from the Marxist tradition and that then mix that Marxist mode of analysis with other discourses that are non-Marxist. And this creates a lot of confusion because those discourses then often either water down or commodify Marxism, might make it trendy and sexy to, a few undereducated people within the petty bourgeois intelligentsia, but doesn't really contribute in any meaningful way to class struggle, and the class struggle in the sense of the class struggle for the workers, not the class struggle from the capitalist ruling class. And so I think it's extremely important to engage with the Marxist tradition. At the same time, I think it's also important. Mao was someone who insisted on this, and that is, he said it in a kind of funny and provocative way. He said, you got to be careful not to read too many books, because you also need to be involved in the struggle. And you need the practical elements and the practical experience so that you're not just reading in a bubble. And another big part of the problem with certain Marxian traditions is that it's discourse for discourse's sake. It's about being right. It's about playing games with ideas and discourses. It's not about solving the most pressing issues of humanity. And so the primacy of practice should be the beating heart of how we approach these texts and ultimately how we judge them, right? Are they serving the project of human liberation or not? And if they are, let's learn as much as we can from them and engage our struggles through the framework of their analysis insofar as they're helpful.
Thank you so much for that, Gabriel. I completely agree with what's been said. Every time I think about just the path of Marxian thought, I just think of a story that I was told to me actually during the People's Forum Revolutionary Summer School, and that Ho Chi Minh he prided himself in that he owned Marx's capital as a pillow initially. And, it wasn't until he really got into the nitty gritty of, understanding the Marxist tradition that, he delved into that and was open to this, history of revolutionary thinking and theorizing, and that it's only it's a living and breathing guide, just as the dialectical material method is. It constantly needs to be refined, as Derek mentioned earlier, and it constantly needs to be in conversation with current and past movements internationally. And so I'm also going to pick up on Nat's question. They say, for those struggling to improve critical thinking, how can the individual get into the practice of moving through those stages from sense to understanding, thinking, and practice? They continue, also for those of us who may not be used to cognitively thinking in that way, but want to, and especially if you're studying, reading, learning, independent of an education system. So let's just say if you're not in school or being traditionally taught by an educator or parent. So I'm going to open that up.
I'm happy to respond, but let me give others a chance.
I had a thought, and maybe this is also a question to you, Gabriel, about that, that what you spoke about, that it's not a linear progression from sense to understanding to practice, but to begin at practice, to begin at observing what we're doing, essentially, wherever we are, and to start understanding that as our practices. And from there, I really like the idea, actually, of trying to observe our own practice and then noticing what we're sensing while doing that, sensing in our bodies, sensing how our senses of the world are shifting as we start to observe what we're doing. So that's what came up for me.
Yeah, I can jump in on this because I think it's a really important point, because for Mao, but I think, outside of Mao, just for us and in our conversation here, if you approach sense perception, understanding, and practice as if they are these discrete entities that are separate and disconnected from one another, you're approaching them non-dialectically. Right? And one of the powers of dialectics is to recognize that relations are primary, not fixed entities. Meaning, more simplistically, right, you are understanding and perceiving and acting in the world all at the same time and all of these elements of your experience are intertwined with one another. And so what Mao, I think, is encouraging us to understand is that, yes, there's this dialectical kind of entwinement of these different elements, but at the same time, we can, from a certain vantage point, recognize that there is a difference between being able to see something and understand where it comes from. And there's an enormous difference between being able to understand something and knowing how to change it, or being able to change it. Right? And so at that level, dialectical thinking allows us to see that, yes, all of these processes are going on at the same time, but even though they're going on at the same time and they're relationally constituted, we can nonetheless distinguish, heuristically between kind of different levels. And I do think that that's important. The other, I guess, point in the question, if I understood it correctly, is how that relates to being outside of a kind of academic framework or academic discourse. I think that that's absolutely essential, in the sense that, Mao was talking about this as he was making the revolution in China. He wasn't talking about it in university lectures, and that it's precisely outside of the academy where we can always be anchored in concrete practice and have the kind of primacy of knowledge with use value, right? Knowing something because it's useful, because it explains something and allows you to navigate and hopefully transform the world. And within the academy, unfortunately, there's so much knowledge that's based on exchange value, where you get invested in something, you learn a set of proper names or fancy ways of speaking, and then you can cash in on that by going to a conference and impressing someone. And we all know how those particular games work. They usually don't have any use value whatsoever to the working and toiling masses. And so I think it's, on the contrary, it's outside of the academy that usually the primacy of practice and the importance of use value is very, very palpable. Because if you say shit that's incoherent but sounds really fancy, nobody's going to care, and it doesn't have any traction in the real world.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, this is actually relates back to childhood, right? Which is like, children are like, whenever I'm around like the babies and young children, like, I just feel like that's what I'm trying to do, because they're like, wait, why do we do this? And you tell them, and you're like, because of this. And they're like, wait, why do we do it that? And it's like, because this. And eventually it's just like, that's just how we do it, right? Which is basically just like, I don't have any more time. And basically us just admitting like there's no we don't really know, like we just do it like that, and we could totally do it differently, right? So but the kid is asking, is like, wait, why do we do it like that? Why can't we do it this other way? And so we all have that kind of, like, I mean, it's not like natural or anything like that, but like that kind of like, like, wait, why? Right? That for me, that's what philosophy really is. It's like, wait, why? Philosophy doesn't really have answers. It has like why, and then, well, maybe this and that, and then you test it out in practice. And I feel like, honestly, critical thinking is, in a sense, like, not the problem, because, I mean, I don't really know what it means to think critically. I know what it means to think, but there's so much critique, and you know, I experienced this in schools, and that's why most of my education, like for real, like came from the movement. You know, I learned way more my first year in like an organization than I did my entire, you know, PhD program, for real. Because it was and I learned because it was like driven by revolutionary optimism. Look, people have changed the world. You know, every social system presents itself as natural and timeless and the culmination of everything that happened before, right? Marx points this out in the introduction to the Grundrisse, actually, right? That's a historical presentation. And so then just realizing that, like, wait, like it wasn't always like this, you know? And in fact, if we were sitting around in like 1840 in the United States, there would be a lot of people like well-meaning of different, you know, nationalities who would be like, well, slavery is terrible, but like, it's just the way it's always been. And like, what are we going to do without it? And like, it's going to be anarchy and whatnot. It helps like, you know, recall that past that is still very present, right? And just like inaugurate the sense of like, oh yeah, possibility. Like actually, we can have revolutions. We literally like the masses of people. You know, not the intellectuals. Intellectuals have never like changed the world, right? And like that was the key for Lenin, right? Is that like the people make the revolution, right? And in the party, all distinctions between intellectuals and workers and other things, they're gone, right? We're all party members, right? And I think that the other thing is like, rather than critical thinking, I'm just interested in thinking, you know, like critical thinking is always about critique. And there's always, you know, how can I problematize this or like, you know, complicate that or whatever. And, you know, I'm always asking like, well, just think, you know, like, what do you think about it? Right. And so I don't know if it's like moving through stages per se, but rather just like kind of thinking about or thinking and experiencing what you're already doing in the world within this framework, and maybe it helps you and maybe it doesn't, right? So that's what I wanted to say with that, about that. It has to be collective. We already do it, you know, basically. And then capital, what it does is just, you know, confines us. It like closes down what we look at. So like I drive to work, and like there's all of a sudden I was looking, I'll be like, wait, what the hell is that? You know, and there's like the whole history, as Gabriel said, about its production. And there's a whole history of the different functions it served, you know, why it's there and how it's changed and what it could be, that we just don't really think about because it's naturalized and because like, you know, I got to get to work, right? Like that's the main thing. And that's the way the capital, again, closes down what we can sense and what we can't sense. And it also explains why, like in Indianapolis, in the last like since 2018, we've had to defeat like 3 different anti-homeless bills, right? That were all about moving homeless people out of the city center, right? To literally like change the field of visibility so that they're like on the outskirts of it.
Yep. I can attest to that also in New York City. That has definitely been a key issue and very visible to anyone who's remotely observant.
And can I say one more thing, actually?
Yeah, for sure.
This reminds me. Because when I first got involved in the struggle, it was like one of the first things I did, I was fortunate to be with this guy named Sam Alcoff, who kind of took me under his wing. And this was after Giuliani's reign of terror in New York City, and he was running for, I think, the governor of New York State. So we organized a protest. And at that time, you know, the cops had shot Amadou Diallo, you know, Abner Louima had happened. And it wasn't really a mass consciousness, you know, like it wasn't in people's field of visibility or audibility. And then I remember in 2010 being in the streets, struggling against police brutality. And the main demand was like body cameras, you know? And I remember thinking like, well, obviously that's not the ultimate solution, but you know, like you can tell people that, but let's take them through the experience, right? And this is why, you know, the Indianapolis police murdered a 39-year-old man, Herman Whitfield III. You can go to IndyLiberationCenter.org to learn about this. We just got the full body cam footage that obviously shows that the cops were lying the whole time. But one of the things that the body cam footage has done is changed and opened up people's like ability to see, right? An ability to like actually understand, right? That this is not like, these are not one-offs, these are not like bad apples, that this is systematic, and that this is basically like a military occupation of oppressed communities in the United States. And so I think that that is like also something that we experience as we go through the movement itself.
Thank you. Yeah, no, completely. I mean, it's the unnamed masses that are leading revolution. I have 2 last questions in the chat that I'm going to voice. One asks, I'm wondering if Derek has looked into Herbert, excuse me if the pronunciation's wrong, Marcuse's perception of aesthetic and language in relation to divorcing from the dominant ideology and discourse, and what his take is on that. And then we also have Khadija, who asks, how do we cut through the, I quote, ideas industry of academia, yet still make use of the various philosophers in the Marxist tradition? So we're just going to let that sit. And if anyone wants to jump in, feel free to.
Somebody else should talk.
Okay. Oh, have I been off mute this whole time? Great. I was just like humming in the back. Sorry. Okay, I think I can say something to the second question. I like it a lot. I mean, I actually don't really have very many answers, but I relate to the question a lot because I think about it a lot, about how to make these ideas that often come from academia, that are very philosophical. Maybe you need a lot of, like ideas industry. Exactly. Thank you, Khadija. That you need like background, I think, basically, to like understand it. And I think something I could say to that is that, one, it's not about you're not smart enough to understand it if you don't have an education and da 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 da. Obviously not, right? Like, also, as like organizers, like, you have to commit to the understanding that working class people are intelligent and can understand things if we just sit with it. And so, but it is difficult in the sense that you haven't read everything that they're referencing, and a lot of times these philosophers will use words and throw things out there and they don't never define it. And then if you read like 30 words on a page that, you know, makes no sense to you with no definitions for it, you're gonna get exhausted and give up, right? So I think that I mean, the only way to overcome it, I would say, is like, I mean, in my imagination, is collectively going through it, and going through it really slowly, I would imagine, you know, like pause at every word that we don't understand and try to, like, someone look it up, or like, does anyone have any idea, or like, we don't understand, you know what I mean? Like, really go through it slowly. And I feel like it takes a lot of time and it's very different probably from how people study those texts in academia. But I think honestly I think a lot of people in academia just pretend to understand things when they don't. But that's what I think. I think that like defining everything, going slowly, is a good way to do it, because a lot of times, like, you know, as like a lot of the people here have demonstrated in their own work, like those ideas can be very useful to us to get us to think. But it's just a question of, you know, us being able to collectively get together and be able to like peer through the jargon, which honestly is useless.
And I think I wanted to speak to the second question as well. You know, I'm not in academia one day. You know, get there one day, but haven't made it there yet. But I think just seeing how there's an idea industry outside of academia. There's an idea industry in community organizing, actually, where they want to sit and they want to talk about Marx and Lenin, but they don't want to put it into practice. And they want to have all these great ideas, and they want to be the holder. They want to be the pedagogue so bad that they forget about the practice. And they also forget that people have been learning since before people were teaching. And so I think how we cut through this, I really agree with Summer, is, you know, working class people, you know, I do believe, I've heard several times in different, you know, academic spaces that I'm in, that, you know, people just need to take their time with it. They just need to sit with it. I also believe that we got to be realistic about the working class goes through on a day-to-day. And what, you know, what actually is in there, what can they do at that moment? How do we meet them where they're at with these texts? And that also means translating it. I speak a different language than everybody on this panel. I speak Southern African American vernacular. So maybe someone should translate it so that it wouldn't take so long for me to grasp it. You know, maybe we should, as organizers and as people as academia, we need to get more creative with how we ask people to engage with these texts. Because at the end of the day, when you're community organizing, asking somebody to join a study group, that's an ask. You're asking them for time. You're asking them for trust. You're asking them for the faith that you'll be able to speak to them. You're asking them for a lot of things. So let's give something back, because that's the only way we're going to cut through this idea industry, is actually give these material things back in a way that they can interpret and understand. And I also quickly want to speak to one of the questions that I wanted to speak to, but I didn't get a chance about is Marxist, is these Marxist texts, are they useless? As somebody, again, who did not grow up in the academic world, who did not know when I first joined the Party for Socialism and Liberation, didn't even know anything about Marx or Lenin. I was like, all right, cool. Like, what can they tell me about my life and my struggle? That was my first thought when I joined the party. And as I went to these different, cadre schools and these different, like, real educational processes, I learned about these different theories that have helped me think dialectically and have helped shape the way that I think and understand my material world and conditions. And no matter how many years go by, no matter how many hundreds and hundreds of years, that's vital. That's vital. Is to change our thinking and change us into dialectical thinkers and shape the way people think and shape the way we interpret and things like that. And I think, the person said that, they're not used to studying, they're not used to this academic. You just figure out a way to make it work for you. There's so many resources, YouTube videos, podcasts. There's so many different ways this, Marxism and Leninism has been transmitted for us to understand it. And it's still being done. Derek did the Capital with Comrades. It's still being twisted and shaped and developed. It just takes, a group, I would always say an organization, to help you find that way that works for you, to help you find the way that you need to learn, and also create a new way to learn. Oh, I didn't understand it this way, but I understood it when I did this. Let me share the wealth of what I just created so that more people who might have this challenge will get it.
Thank you. I think, just in response to, the question about Marcuse, one thing is that, it's from the Frankfurt School, and in Gabriel's piece that came out in Domination and Emancipation, he makes an exception for Marcuse as one of the few of the Frankfurt School who advised, who was a PhD advisor for Angela Davis, and how he's been actually written out of that history. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Gabriel. But anyways, in terms of his thing about, it's thinking about aesthetics and politics, I think, I'm not an expert, but the one of the reasons why I don't go there, and instead I start with Rockhill and de la Pence's work, is because they don't, they argue there's no such thing as art, right? Like, art is not this thing, right? Neither is politics. Art becomes art, right, as a result of struggles over its production, its distribution, and its consumption, right? And it becomes political in the, when it's integrated into battles, right? And those battles to make something are political, right? And the only reason we could even think about aesthetics or art as separate categories is because we live in a society with an advanced division of labor, right? It's a point Althusser makes. Like, you can't have literary criticism that says this is artistic work and this is not artistic work without like a very advanced division of labor and people actually do that and then map these categories onto other things and make us think, which is why I was always discouraged. I didn't think I could understand aesthetics or art, right? And I still, and that's what I like about it, is because I don't understand it, right? We don't have to understand or know everything or like be comfortable with everything. The texts that I like the most are the ones that I read again and again because I never know. There's texts that I teach, like I've taught like 18 times. And every time I read it, I'm like, wait, I didn't notice that before. Or like, honestly, I still don't know what that means, And that's an important, I think, part of teaching too, just being like, I don't know, I'm just doing the best I can also, right? And the other thing, of course, is, the autonomy of art thesis. And this is something that I bring up in the introduction in chapter 1, which is like, the idea that art is like autonomous from society, or should be. In Rockhill's book, Radical History and the Politics of Art, I think he talks about how the autonomy of art thesis was actually like, one, it's like a social product, right? And also it served political purposes because it was used by anti-communist forces to basically say, like, look at all of the art in social societies, it's all about, politics. And so therefore we have real freedom in the United States because art can be about anything you want it to be, right? So this idea that art is autonomous is actually an extremely political idea and is actually like basically a weapon, right? In terms of breaking out of the theory industry, one, Marx wasn't writing for academics, right? He wasn't. He was, and this is I end the introduction with this. I talked about this elsewhere, but like, Marx and Engels, they were always the masses have to liberate themselves, and we can't tolerate anybody or any group who talks down to them as if they can't understand them, right? Because usually that's just what happens, and that's alienating, and it's like off-putting, and it's just, you know, it's also not true, right? Because nobody's really like smarter than anybody else per se. And the other thing is like moving intellectual, the idea that intellectual and like production and ideas happen in the university is like a strange one to me, being in the university, because like there's much more thinking and intellectual production that goes on in the streets and in the struggles and in the community organizations, and there's actually like very little, and you know, not to discount the work that, you know, people do in academia, but like for me, that's not the place intellectual production happens, particularly like revolutionary intellectual production happens, right? Like no idea has been created in the university and it's been like disseminated and caused a revolution, right? That's not how it works. So that's where intellectual production takes place in the very, you know, at the beginning. And then the idea industry and the movement, we need to pay more attention to this, you know, like the response to the, you know, really insurgent movement of Black people and young people and Chicano people at the time and LGBT people in the 60s and 70s. You know, that counteroffensive was like obviously based on political repression, assassinations, imprisonments, etc., but also like through all these nonprofit NGOs and the production and the proliferation of all these ideas to kind of blunt the revolutionary edge. And we see that infiltrate struggles all the time. And that's why I'm talking about overcoming this break in ideological continuity, right? Which is not to say that, you know, again, for me, Marxism, it's like, I don't care what it's called ultimately, right? Like you can call it whatever you want. I usually talk about communism, you know, but it can be something else, you know? It's not about like who, you know, what name we attach to it or like where it comes from or when it comes from. It's about its ability to help us understand and transform the world ultimately. And so I think, oh yeah, the other thing is I would recommend that people pick up Nino Brown's edited book, Revolutionary Education, because I think that has a lot of, at the end, it has some like, you know, teaching strategies, discussion strategies, but also talks a lot more about this in terms of, you know, like translating all of this into actual political spaces. Oh, and the other thing is, look how much, in terms of translation, look at how significant, you know, the socialist states, especially the USSR at the beginning, what were in actually alphabetizing languages. You know, the Bolsheviks called Russia the prison house of nations because there were like, you know, I think over 100 nationalities living within it. They were all forced to speak Russian. You know, they couldn't speak their own language. And one of the first things the Soviets did was they started to finally alphabetize and to give people the right to speak their own language. And even at one point, like if there were two or four students in a school that were of a minority nationality, they could petition to be taught, have their kids taught in their language, you know, read in their language, sing in their language, and all of that. So like, you know, we have to have power in order to do that though, right?
Thank you so much for these really fruitful last lingering thoughts. I know I'm leaving this talk feeling more energized and full of revolutionary optimism than before I came in here. So I think everyone who's joined us in this panel and all the panelists who have joined today, I'm like, please pat yourself on the back. I feel like everyone has just this community of theorists and thinkers and writers and just revolutionary people is ultimately just being in your presence is a gift. So thank you so much for everyone, and thank you to Derek for giving us a reason to be in the same room together today. I know we're all so proud of this piece of scholarship, and we urge our audience to read this book and add their own critiques and thoughts. So if anyone else has any other last minute thoughts, I think we're good to wrap up. Thank you so much for everyone who's tuned in, and all of our co-sponsors at the People's Forum, Midnight Books, Mayday Books, Iskra Books, everyone, all the panelists, Kim Smith, Derek Ford, Jennifer De La Ponce, who couldn't be here today, Summer Papachin, Gabriel Rockhill, everyone, thank you so much for being a part of this discussion, and I hope that we can revisit for that workshop that workshop book that we were talking about at the end, perhaps another project in the works. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you all have a lovely weekend. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.